Hi, it's Nicole. This is my second year joining Jane Austen July. In this video, I'm going to share my planning process and the possible titles for myself. I'll also recommend some titles for you according to each challenge. There are 7 challenges. I aim to complete the 5 reading challenges and probably skip the watching ones. I'm also adding a theatre focus on top of the challenges as a twist because of my fascination with everything theatre at the moment. The first challenge is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. If I say theatre, which of the 6 novels do you think of immediately? For me, it's Mansfield Park. A big chunk of the novel revolves around a play that the characters try to rehearse and perform. The play in the novel is called Lover's Vow, a 1798 play by Elizabeth Inchbald about sex outside marriage and illegitimate birth, according to Wikipedia. Mansfield Park was published 16 years later in 1814. This is the potential title I choose for Challenge 5, which is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. Mansfield Park is one of my less preferred Austen novels, mostly because of the personality of Fanny. There's an essay by C.S. Lewis called A Note on Jane Austen, analysing Austen heroines, which I highly recommend. He puts the 6 novels into 2 categories and asks why only Fanny Price reads like a self-righteous moralist, while Lizzie Bennet and Anne Elliot don't, even though they judge people with the same moral standard. I'd like to reread this essay for Challenge 3, which is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or her time. The second challenge is to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. I'd like to read Austen's juvenilia this year, especially the history of England. I chose this one specifically because she voiced her opinion on Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, Edward IV, Edward V, Richard III, Henry VII, and Henry VIII, all of whom appear in Shakespeare's history plays. If you are considering joining Jane Austen July, I recommend reading Jane Austen's letters for this challenge alongside a biography of Jane Austen for Challenge 3. I read her letters alongside Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home last year. They work brilliantly as a pair. The biography provides context to the letters, so the letters don't read so much like listening to one side of a telephone conversation. At the same time, the letters add first-person perspective and fascinating details to certain events in Jane Austen's life. The third challenge is to read a non-fiction work about Jane Austen or her time. I mentioned C.S. Lewis' essay already. For the theatre focus, I specifically want to read The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne. Thanks, Katie, for recommending it. This book is the starting point of my theatre-focused Jane Austen July. I didn't squeeze it in last year because I want to make the most of it this year. The subtitle of the book explains it well. The Genius of Jane Austen, Her Love of Theatre, and Why She is a Hit in Hollywood. In the introduction, it says, this book offers the first comprehensive account of Jane Austen's interest in the theatre. But more than this, it also suggests that her playgoing and her reading of plays were a formative influence on her comic art. Part 1 of the book reviews her interest in the world of theatre and drama, while Part 2 suggests that there is something intrinsically dramatic about her vision of the world in many of her major novels. Not only Mansfield Park, but also Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma. I'm really keen to find out if Austen ever voiced any opinions on Shakespeare or if she was influenced by Shakespeare in any way. I couldn't tell at all from the table of content, but praise be to God, there is such a thing as an index in the world. And I was thrilled to see Shakespeare, William, and multiple of his plays listed underneath. Yippee! Like last year, I'm going to read this one before I read Mansfield Park, so hopefully I can read Mansfield Park through a new lens and see new things. I'm very excited about this one. On a similar subject, but by a different author, I found an article called How Jane Austen Created a Shakespearean World in Pride and Prejudice by Harold Bloom. I feel like Paula Byrne is more of a Jane Austen expert, judging by the list of books she wrote, and Harold Bloom is more of a Shakespeare expert, judging by the size of the invention of the human. But please don't quote me. I thought it would be interesting to look at this subject from both perspectives. Continue with the third challenge, to read a non-fiction work. My fourth potential choice is What Matters in Jane Austen. Last year I paired this one with Pride and Prejudice, and I read this one first for the new length I was just talking about. It was the first book I read that analyzes Austen's novels. Each chapter focuses on one subject and looks across all her novels to find a common pattern. The chapter titles are: How much does age matter? Do sisters sleep together? What do the characters call each other? How do Jane Austen's characters look? Who dies in the course of her novels? Why is it risky to go to the seaside? Why is the weather important? Do we ever see the lower classes? Which important characters never speak in the novels? What games do characters play? Is there any sex in Jane Austen? What do characters say when the heroine is not there? How much money is enough? Why do her plots rely on blunders? What do characters read? Are ill people really to blame for their illnesses? What makes characters blush? What are the right and wrong ways to propose marriage? When does Jane Austen speak directly to the reader? How experimental a novelist is Jane Austen? It's fascinating. I read it in such a rush last year, I can't remember why, so I borrowed it from the library again. Autumn recommended Our Tempestuous Day, A History of Regency England to me last year. I haven't read it, but I haven't forgotten about it. Thanks, Autumn. Challenge 4 is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. I was going to excuse myself from challenge 4, mostly because I have too many options for challenge 3, but while I was doing the research, I came across two exciting possibilities. The Dynasts is an epic drama by Thomas Hardy about the war with Napoleon. I immediately thought this would be a perfect choice for my theatre-themed Jane Austen July, until I found out it has 19 acts and 130 scenes. It sounds like One Piece in a drama form. I'm interested, but I think planning should be kept realistic. This is not even remotely realistic. Let me know if you've read this. The more realistic possibility is Jeanette Winterson's The Passion. The blurb on Blackwell's says, Henry has a passion for Napoleon, but Napoleon has a passion for chicken. As soldier and emperor butcher their way across Europe, glory falls to ruin and love turns to hate. But when Henry encounters the red-haired, web-footed Villanelle, he discovers in her an equal. Together they abandon their pasts and flee to the Venetian canals to meet their singular dynasty in the city of chance and disguises. On Goodreads is under the categories of fiction, historical fiction, magical realism, LGBT, among others. I have never tried any Jeanette Winterson before, and very little magical realism. And it's under 200 pages. I'm tempted. If you've read it, let me know if you'd recommend it. An unusual choice I'd recommend for a historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time would be Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. It's a fantasy novel set during the Napoleonic Wars about the two last magicians of England. One of the most memorable scenes for me was Jonathan Strange fighting in the war using his magic power and his fellow soldiers calling him Merlin. I read it somewhere that if Jane Austen hadn't taken the title already, this book could certainly be called Sense and Sensibility. It's also very cleverly written in the style of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. Just beware, it's massive. I personally think Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell feels more like Vanity Fair. which is another candidate for this challenge. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray is a Victorian classic set in the Regency era. Vanity Fair is one of my all-time favorites. It shares a lot of themes with Austen's novels like marriage, money, and romance. Like Mansfield Park, there is a show in Vanity Fair too. Challenge 5 is to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen. As I mentioned right at the beginning, I plan to read Lover's Vows by Elizabeth Inchbald. I'd like to read this one before Mansfield Park as well, so when I get to the chapters where they divide up the roles, I can hopefully understand why it's so outrageously inappropriate. I'm very excited about Jane Austen July. Thank you to our hosts for the fun every year. I link my last year's planning video here, where I mentioned a few other titles for each challenge, just in case you want more options. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.